What's going on, my fellow rock and rollers? Don't forget to smash the bell notification icon to be notified every time I put out a new video on my channel. Now, formed in Finland in 1979 by singer Mike Monroe and guitarist Andy Mccoy, Hanoi Rocks shared more in common with traditional rock and roll, glam, and punk than the LA hair metal scene that they're sometimes associated with. While yes, they would play an important role in the hair metal scene of the 80s, it was more having to do with who they influenced, including Guns N' Roses, Skid Row, and Poison. In fact, someone had to show those bands the way, and Hanoi Rocks was up to the challenge. And Hanoi Rocks could have went on to become one of the biggest bands of the 80s had it not been for a terrible tragedy that served as the catalyst to derail the band. Stay tuned for the band's full story. Hanoi Rocks frontman Mike Monroe was born Matti Antero Kristian Fagerholm in 1962 in Finland. His father was a famous radio and TV personality. Monroe would reveal in his autobiography that his real first exposure to rock and roll was seeing Black Sabbath perform a show in Paris on TV, and that memory would stay with him for the rest of his life. Also influencing Monroe at a young age was the first two concerts he ever went to as a kid, which was the bands Slade and Sweet. And in 1976, Monroe would play in a band called Madness, and he just happened to share the same rehearsal space and drummer with guitarist Andy Mccoy, who played in a punk rock band named Briard. It was there that the two met and started talking and hitting it off. And Monroe at one point almost joined McCoy's band, but was told he'd have to cut his hair. While Monroe was against cutting his hair, the seeds of Hanoi Rocks were being carefully planted, as he would tell Louder Sound. The punk thing was great, but you can join our punk band if you cut your hair. What? To be in punk fashion? I'm not going to be a slave to fashion, he'd remember. So I said no, and me and Andy started talking about putting a real band together, the way we thought a cool rock band should be, and that's how Hanoi started. After skipping the army, I wasn't going to cut my hair just to be in a band, he'd say. Monroe would eventually leave home and move to Stockholm, Sweden, and started another punk band called Nymphomaniac. The band would quickly fall apart, and Monroe would move back to Helsinki. And by the summer of 1979, Monroe was back again in Sweden, and would meet future Hanoi Rocks rhythm guitarist Nasty Suicide through Andy Mccoy. Andy was in a new band at the time named Pelle Miljoona, but he was still interested in forming a band with Monroe. And riding the bus one day, Andy suggested the name Chinese Rocks, named after the Johnny Thunder song, and then Hanoi Rocks, and well, the rest was history. And Hanoi Rocks would be formed in 1979, but funny enough, McCoy wasn't in the first incarnation of the group because he was still playing in his other band. But McCoy did have an understanding with Monroe that he would eventually join Hanoi Rocks, and the only members of the classic lineup who were in the first incarnation of the band was Mike Monroe and Nasty Suicide. And the band soon hit the Finnish club circuit, playing a mix of Cheap Trick, MC5, and the Police covers, along with songs Monroe and McCoy had written. At one of the band's early shows, a fellow named Seppo, who was responsible for bringing Iggy Pop and the Stooges to Finland, was in attendance and showed some interest in managing the band. We'll talk a little bit more about him later. When McCoy was ready to join the group, they would relocate to Sweden and have drummer Jip Casino and bassist Sammy Jaffa join the band. This is where things got difficult for Hanoi Rocks. Most of the members were literally living in the street, as Monroe would tell Louder Sound. When we started Hanoi Rocks, we were homeless. I had a few hundred Finnish marks, not much, when I left home and ended up in Stockholm, so for me, Sammy Jaffa and Nasty Suicide were living on the streets for the first 6 months, begging for change. We'd beg enough to get a hamburger to share or a bottle of wine to forget about the hunger. We befriended other homeless people, and we'd sometimes go to the bar and I'd chat up some girl, and she'd invite me to her house. I'd say, "Do you mind if my friends come along?" Then we got to the house and we head straight for the fridge. He would go on to reveal that Andy Mccoy would be living with his girlfriend during this time, and Jip had an apartment during their time in Sweden. It was life on the streets that would eventually shape the group's attitude, image, and sound. And according to Monroe, Sweden was merely a stopover for the band, whose final destination was London, England, because as he saw it, that's where the center of the music scene seemed to be at the time. He would go on to reveal to Louder Sound that the band got no love from their home country in the early days, saying, "In the late 70s in Finland, looking like us was suicide. The general atmosphere was negative. People were very narrow-minded and intolerant of anything different. Hanoi changed a lot of that. We added a little color and forced the Finnish people to be more open-minded. They hated us until we started getting famous abroad. After the band had been in Sweden for 6 months, Seppo, who had previously expressed interest in managing the band, came to Sweden to check out the band and was so impressed he decided to become their manager. And he began booking shows for the group, and that's when they finally started to make money. In 1980, the band struck a deal with a Finnish record label who helped put out the band's first single titled I Want You, Kill City Kills. Later that same year, the band headed into the studio to record their debut record titled Bangkok Shocks, Saigon Shakes, Hanoi Rocks. Originally released only in the Scandinavian countries, the album became a top 5 hit in Finland. The album would be produced by both McCoy and Monroe under the name the Muddy Twins. And while the album is held in high regards by the public, both McCoy and Monroe have had mixed feelings about the record, with Monroe claiming he can't even listen to the record since he wasn't a fan of his voice on the album. But perhaps the most famous song off the record was the track called Tragedy, which would foreshadow the band's future. Following their debut release, the band eventually found their way to London to promote the record and record their follow-up, 1982's Oriental Beat. And when the band arrived in London, they were the antithesis of what was going on in the music scene. Post-punk was popular and many in the press labeled them as just another glam band, which Monroe resented. And Oriental Beat was a monumental album for the band's career as it opened up new markets beyond the Scandinavian countries, as the group would become hugely popular in both the UK and Japan. Also helping the band's popularity in the UK was that Kerrang! Magazine published their first article about the band when they reviewed the album Oriental Beat, which they praised. For the rest of Hanoi Rocks' career, Kerrang! Covered the band heavily. And it was during the tour to support the record in Japan that the band would sign a deal with Mercury Polygram, and as the band's star was rising, they soon began indulging in excesses. The band members started to partake in drugs, especially drummer Jip Cassina, who got into heroin, and it was also during this time that the band found a new home in London in 1982, where they would play a memorable gig at the Zigzag Club in June of that year. A member of the crowd would accost Mike Monroe, claiming that he was a better drummer than Jip Cassino, and that audience member would turn out to be future drummer Nicholas Charles Dingley, or Razzle. The band would end up giving him a shot. Up until this point, Monroe knew Razzle already, as they had met several times prior, including at a Johnny Thunder show. And Razzle came to the attention of the band at the right time because they were tired of Jip's penchant for heroin, and Andy Mccoy didn't think his playing was up to snuff and just didn't like him personally. The pair even got into a fight on stage. So Jip would eventually be fired and replaced with Razzle. And prior to Razzle joining the band, Hanoi Rocks were in a bad place and on the verge of breaking up. Monroe would reveal to Louder Sound that the addition of Razzle made the band perfect, and that his attitude, spirit, brought us back to life. The band was at a low point around that time. We were going into some seriously bad shit with Andy hanging out with hardcore junkies. Razzle wasn't great technically, but he had a gung-ho up against the world attitude and fit in with the band style perfectly. I loved that he was totally determined to be in the band, and when he joined, we were a real gang. Before the end of 1982, the band would release Self-Destruction Blues, their third record, which mostly consisted of singles and B-sides recorded over the past several years. By early 1983, Hanoi Rocks would play their first gigs outside of Europe, touring across Israel, India, Hong Kong, Japan, and Thailand. In fact, Hanoi Rocks was the first band to play the Indian capital of New Delhi. And the nation of Japan was one of several countries where Hanoi Rocks became superstars. The fans were so rabid in Japan that they broke into the group's hotels just to see the musicians, and the ticket prices were as expensive as the bands who filled up stadiums. On top of that, some of the phone booths in Tokyo would play Hanoi Rock songs. That's not to say the band was well received everywhere they went. The band's shows in Israel were especially noteworthy. The band was booked to play during Passover, which meant that the country's citizens could not buy or sell yeast, which meant no beer. But the band's manager had made a deal with the promoters that the band would consume free alcohol throughout the entire duration of their stay. Also complicating matters was that Israel had only started promoting rock concerts a year earlier and never witnessed any band remotely resembling Hanoi Rocks. Monroe and most of the band would have trouble leaving the hotel because of their appearance. Local residents thought the band were scantily dressed women and began to harass them and spit on them. Monroe would look back at the gig in Israel, recalling, "I was always like, what am I going to wake up to next? What have the guys done now? I'm amazed we got out of Israel without being thrown in jail. They were drinking 24 hours a day, not trying to get a reputation. It's just the way we were. Maybe it's being part Finnish. They'd always get into situations that get out of control. I mean, nasty suicide." On May 18, 1983, the band released their critically acclaimed album Back to Mystery City, and it was the first record to feature new drummer Razzle, and the band followed that up by recording a concert at London's historic venue, the Marquee, in December of that year, titled All Those Wasted Years. The success set the stage for Hanoi Rocks to get the attention of a major US label, and that they did. The band would sign a 3-record deal with CBS Records the same year for £150,000. CBS would push for the band's next album, titled Two Steps from the Move, to feature a hit song, which just happened to be a cover of the Creedence Clearwater Revival song Up Around the Bend. The album would be produced by Alice Cooper's Bob Ezrin in Toronto, Canada and New York City, and it would also sadly be the last album to feature drummer Razzle. The album would be released in the fall of 1984 to coincide with the group's first US tour that would begin in November. The band was on a roll. Their single Up Around the Bend was getting play on MTV and on Much Music in Canada, and great reviews just seemed to come pouring in. And it was during their tour of the United States that the members of the band, excluding Mike Monroe, took their inebriated behavior to new heights, with Monroe recalling to Classic Rock magazine, "On that American tour, everyone was so fucked up out of their minds 24 hours a day, mainly drinking. So I was not having much fun, but I would sit there and drink my orange juice and put up with it. It was really boring because whenever we go to rehearsals, after half a song, it would be F it, let's go to the pub." Nasty was the one who was a really heavy drinker. He ended up in a kidney machine once he drank my aftershave because the mini bars were empty, he'd remember. And it was during the tour of the United States, during a gig in New York City, that frontman Mike Monroe broke his ankle after jumping off a drum riser. The injury wouldn't stop the band from continuing on with the tour. The band soldiered on, playing through a series of dates across Detroit, Chicago, Cleveland, and Boston, but the pain for Monroe got so severe the band had to cancel their show in Atlanta, and the label would send the group to LA to do press for the record. The band's show in Boston would be the last gig with Razzle, but also waiting in Los Angeles for the band were their friends Motley Crue, who had befriended Hanoi Rocks earlier in the year when Motley Crue played the Monsters of Rock festival. Motley Crue was having a party in honor of Hanoi Rocks' first US tour, and the band, including Razzle, were hanging out at Vince Neil's house, partying when they ran out of alcohol. Neil and Razzle, both of whom were reportedly drinking, decided to drive to the liquor store. Neil, who was in the driver's seat, was driving down a winding road in Hollywood and lost control of the vehicle and smashed into an oncoming car. All of the people involved in the collision suffered injuries, with the exception of Razzle, who was taken to the South Bay Hospital, where he was declared dead. He would pass away at the young age of 24. Neil would be sentenced to only 30 days in jail and would be let out 10 days early for good behavior. Neil would also have to pay millions in damages to the families impacted by the accident and do public service announcements, and Neil would even tell Blender magazine how he expressed remorse over the incident, claiming, "I wrote a $2.5 million check for vehicular manslaughter when Razzle died. I should have gone to prison. I definitely deserve to go to prison, but I did 30 days in jail and got laid and drank beer because that's the power of cash. That's effed up," he'd conclude. And in a 2006 interview with Metal Express, Hanoi guitarist Andy Mccoy gave his own version of the incident, revealing, "I was there. What happened was Razzle disappeared and so did Vince. So me and T-Bone, Tommy Lee, took his car and went out looking for them. We drove past this accident, and I was like, what color was the car they were driving? Because we just passed an effing accident with a bright red sports car. Then I saw Razzle's hat in the street." And in 2011, Monroe told Sleaze Rocks his feelings almost 30 years after the incident, saying, "There was an accident, and unfortunately our drummer was killed. As far as Vince Neil, I have nothing to say. It was an accident. What happened, happened, and it can't be changed. Everybody suffered from the whole thing." The band was devastated by the tragedy, and the rest of their US tour was cancelled. The group did, however, have 2 gigs back home in Helsinki, Finland, early in 1985 that they were determined to play in memory of Razzle. The concerts were part of a television broadcast. It was reported that Motley Crue drummer Tommy Lee was going to fill in for Razzle, but that never came to fruition. Instead, the band would enlist ex-Clash drummer Terry Chimes to play the gigs, and bootlegs of both of the shows are available online. By this point in time, Sammy had already made up his mind that he was leaving the band even before the US tour ended, and those 2 shows in Finland would be his last with the band. Sammy leaving was the final nail in the coffin for Monroe, who would tell Classic Rock magazine that Sammy Jaffa leaving the band was another deciding factor. Everybody was vital to the chemistry of that family unit, so without Sammy, there was just me, Andy, and Nasty left. The new guys had the wrong attitude. They'd been a disaster and ruined a good memory of a great band. That's why it was crucial to finish Hanoi Rocks in mid-85, put it to rest with integrity intact. If we'd persevered and become one of the biggest bands in the world, it would have been even worse. No matter how much money we'd have had, no matter how much fame, it would have been cursed, he'd say. Following the gig, Andy Mccoy would leave with his new girlfriend to Sri Lanka, leaving behind Mike and Nasty in London to hire a new bass player, who they found in Rennie Berg. The chemistry, though, just wasn't there, and Berg at one point reportedly tried to call the shots in the band and was quickly replaced by Timo Kaltio. Throughout all the drama, Monroe planned to quit the band in early 1985, but the record label convinced him to stay and do a short tour in Poland, where the single Don't You Ever Leave Me was climbing up the charts, and Monroe reluctantly agreed under the condition that no live record would be released. The compromise was made that a semi-official live album was released. Appropriately titled Rock and Roll Divorce, the album was slammed by the band's managers, band members, and critics alike, and Monroe would eventually have enough and call it quits. Monroe would go on to enjoy a successful solo career, and for his second solo record released in 1989 titled Not Fakin' It, it would feature Guns N' Roses vocalist Axl Rose in the video for Dead Jailer Rock and Roll. And Hanoi Rocks was a massive influence on members of Guns N' Roses, and the band would lobby their own label Geffen Records to re-release Hanoi Rocks' catalog on their vanity label Uzi Suicidal, and get Tom Zutaut, who signed Guns N' Roses, to oversee the project. Monroe, for his part, would make an appearance on the Guns N' Roses Use Your Illusion records and the Spaghetti Incident. The re-release of the band's back catalog on Guns N' Roses' Uzi Suicidal label in the mid-90s only got the band more exposure and increased their fan base, despite the fact that the band was no longer active. And in February of 2001, Monroe and McCoy would reunite for the first time since 1985 in Finland. They toured again in the summer of 2001 under the name Hanoi Revisited. Following the tour, Monroe and McCoy agreed to keep playing together, and the pair would refer to it as a rebirth and not a reformation of the band, as Razzle was dead, Nasty Suicide was now a pharmacist, and Sammy Jaffa was involved with the New York Dolls, while Gyp Casino was done in music. The rebirth of the band would write and record several more albums, and the new incarnation would disband in 2008, where they would play a series of farewell shows in their homeland, where Nasty Suicide would make a guest appearance. That does it for today's video, guys. Thanks for watching. Be sure to hit the like button and subscribe. And as always, if you have suggestions for future topics, let me know in the comment section below. Take care.